And then, of course, as usual, I'll follow up the webinar with a link to the recording and link to the slides if you would like access to that. So we'll have that sent around to go around. Also, there's a chat window there, so feel free if you have questions that come up along the way, go ahead and type them up there, and at the end I'll address those before we dive out of here. All right, guys. So for those, I see a lot of familiar faces. It looks like a lot of new ones in here too. So it's actually a pretty packed room. This might be one of the biggest webinars we've ever had. So I do definitely appreciate you joining. For those that don't know me, my name is Brian Hahn. I work as a consultant at MTradecraft. I've been on kind of both sides of the fence. I've been a CCO and COO for a couple different SEC registered RIAs and hedge funds. Also did a little time at Bridgewater Associates, and then have done some intelligence contracting in Costa Rica, but been with doing MTradecraft since 2009. So I just focus on SEC registered firms and building secure and compliant cybersecurity programs. I don't sell ongoing IT services or managed service provider type services. We simply do audits, making sure firms are compliant and have secure networks. And I think reason we're here today is to discuss 20649, which is the SEC's new cybersecurity regulation coming down the pipeline. So I just want to share some of my thoughts about it and share with you some of the conversations we're having with our clients on how to prepare for it. If you haven't checked it out yet or really gotten into the topic too much, I think 20649 and all the other regulations under it that kind of nest under it, I think they're 260 pages. Some the last time I looked at it, but the SEC did give us this handy little 2-pager that gives us kind of a quick background and talks about some of the proposed amendments, and that's what we're going to dive into in detail today. Are these areas. So if you haven't checked out this 2-pager, I highly recommend it. It'll give you an overview of what's going on, and then you can dive into the larger report as needed as you're building out your program. When we describe the situation with our clients and talk about what's happening, in a sense, it almost looked like a snowball is starting to go downhill. The way we would work with clients in the past and perform our audits is we used to take the examination information request list that the SEC would send clients and kind of take the different IT and cybersecurity related requests that they would demand during the examinations, and we would work backwards and build that for our clients and make sure they had the documentation for those examinations. So we're moving from a period of guidance where, the SEC would come out and say, hey, this is kind of the best practices we're seeing. This is what we recommend you do, to a period of regulation where we're actually going to have, written regulations that we have to comply with in our compliance program. So if you haven't been to my website, on the front page there, you'll see a document, what cybersecurity compliance documentation does the SEC require. That's definitely a handy one to check out. I think we're at 6 or 7 pages in there. It's a PDF of just the different cybersecurity and IT related requests we've seen from the SEC in the past. So that's always a great document to go through as you're kind of thinking about your program and how would you respond in an audit. So definitely check that out if you haven't. So let's talk about the paperwork. When I frame building a cybersecurity compliance program, and in my mind, there's the paperwork and then there's the technical aspect. So we'll start with the paperwork. I definitely have a ton of other webinars and some recorded and posted on YouTube where we dive more into the technical aspects of how we would actually do this, what software we'd use, what operations we would use, et cetera. So I'm not going to cover that in today's webinar. We're simply going to focus on the paperwork, but I'd also encourage you to check that out if that's something you're interested in with your firm. First and foremost, we're going to have a policies and procedures manual. I don't think it makes a difference if you put it into your overall policies and procedures manual with your firm, or if you keep it separate as a cybersecurity policies and procedures manual. Me personally, I like to keep it separate just because it's a little bit easier to edit. I think especially with the new regulations, we're going to be doing a lot of editing. So that's something I recommend seeing separate, but from a regulatory standpoint, I don't think it matters. But we definitely have to have policies and procedures that outline our cybersecurity policy. I think one of the biggest fails I see within firms is just this templated policy that they've downloaded from, wherever, and they'll say, oh, we have best practices to protect our clients' data, and those type of policies and procedures aren't going to cut it anymore. You're going to have detailed explanations. Okay, we've put our data on Google servers. We protected it with two-factor authentication. We regulate who amongst our employees has access to that data. In other words, we're going to need very detailed descriptions in that policies and procedures manual around how you're conducting your cybersecurity framework. We're also going to see, maybe lawyers can correct me on this. I believe this is a brand new form, is the form ADVC. So this is going to be a mandatory regulatory disclosure of incidences. So if you have someone that gets phished, if you have a cyber attack, if you have a ransomware attack, it's now going to be a reportable event to the SEC on form ADVC. So, of course, if you ever get to that, I would highly recommend, engaging with an attorney at that point. I won't dive into it here, but there's a lot of security issues that come into both kind of this item, the form ADVC, and then in the next item, we're going to talk about the updates that are going to be required to form ADV Part 2A. For me, being a security consultant, we're going to have to disclose a lot of sensitive information now that people can look up and learn about our firm, which in my mind is, as a security consultant, makes us more vulnerable. So, I've had webinars where I cover other issues on that, but ultimately it looks like, in the latest renderings of the regulations, it's here to stay, and we're going to have to deal with it. So, it's just my highest recommendation that if you get to that, make sure you engage an attorney to help you through that process, so that we're not giving away more information than we need to in filing those documents. Disclosure of risk to clients now on the form ADV Part 2A. I guess my question is, how many clients are actually reading the Part ADV 2A? But for those that are, my concern is, well, do they really have the ability to decipher what we're putting in there about, disclosing our cybersecurity policy publicly? How does that benefit clients? These are the questions that come to my mind. But ultimately, that's what we're going to have. So form Part ADV 2A is going to have a mandatory disclosure of cybersecurity risks to your clients. That's both perceived threats and past incidences will have to be disclosed on form ADV Part 2A. We're also going to see regulation about the proper cyber record keeping. So how are you going to store the logs, reports, the cybersecurity audits, the vulnerability audits, the pen test? How are you going to store this information, access it, and of course, build on it? So if you find a vulnerability, what's your remediation process look like? How are you tracking that? We're going to have to start keeping record of that. We're also seeing in the 20649 regulation, it's going to be a mandatory annual review of your cybersecurity policy and all supporting documentation. In this review, the latest regulation will have the board of director. So let me step back for a second. Part of the regulation that we're seeing is that you're going to need to disclose the cybersecurity expertise of your board. And so the board of directors is going to be required to sign off on the annual review there. Of course, the idea just trying to get senior management more involved. So that's going to be the core foundation of your paperwork. The one document that I like to add is an employee technology usage agreement. I think this is a very important document for firms to have. The way I see it is I like to have the firm give the cybersecurity policies and procedures manual to the employee, have the employee sign off that they receive that manual once annually. And that way we can sign off and show that the employee is aware of the firm's cybersecurity policies and procedures and how to handle private information, private client data, private information. And then I also like to have the employee technology usage agreement to accompany that. This is usually a 2 or 3 page document where the employee signs off, making sure they understand their requirements in protecting data, like don't use public Wi-Fi, don't send emails to addresses that you can't verify, all the little things. Make sure you verify wire transfers, all these little things that make up for security. I like to have that in a separate employee technology usage agreement for them. We're also going to have some proof of employee cybersecurity awareness training, whether you're doing this as the CCO, kind of as part of your annual compliance audit, or you hire an outside firm. In some way, you're going to have documentation of that. We offer a program called FieldCraft that automates this process for you, helps you train the employees and all that. We even have a version, if you have less than 10 employees, you can get access to that program for free to go through some training with them. So if you haven't done any training, a small firm, definitely take advantage of that. I also, with my clients, I like to have what I call like a searchable database or a searchable repository of all of these cybersecurity logs, reports, audits, and records. Again, I keep referencing other webinars, but I definitely dive into that more in other webinars and show how we build that. And I'll touch a little bit on it at the surface level here. But for me, when I am securing a firm's network, I want to have a database of every single detail about that firm's IT infrastructure. What's connected externally? Where's data flowing? What systems are connected? What operating systems are running on those systems? Who owns those systems? Just an endless supply of information. I like to put that in a repository so that anytime we do get a request from the SEC, it's very simple to go in and pull the data that they need and put it into a report that we can give them. Of course, for our own use, we want to have a major database full of information that we can access, but when we need to turn over requested information to the SEC, or if you're applying for cybersecurity insurance or your custodian is requesting evidence, whatever the case may be, we want to show that, when we turn it over, we can turn over the exact information that they're asking for and nothing more. So a couple extra, bits of paperwork that I like to see in terms of what I think builds out a full cybersecurity compliance folder. So let's dive into the policies and procedures manual. And when you read the full documentation of 20649, we start to get kind of key pieces of information about what should be included in there. So there's mention of risk and threat assessment, not only internally, but also for your vendors. When I do threat assessments internally, I like to look at, like what I call hacker view. Like, how does a hacker view your firm? If someone's coming after you, what information is available out there? What emails have been involved in past breaches and have, your username and your password and your IP address already leaked out there that we can find. If you post PDFs to your website, are you properly scrubbing the metadata and making sure you're removing usernames or passwords or anything that may be in the metadata of those documents? These are all things that I like to include in an internal risk and threat assessment. I think one of the questions on my mind, and I think a lot of people that I talk to are still trying to figure out, what's the best way to do this, especially for smaller firms, but that's how do we approach, vendor due diligence. If you're a small firm under 50 employees and you hire, Microsoft Office 365 and Azure to run your environments, it's really not that complex and we can build that. But if it's been, a hodgepodge of systems coming up together, how do we show that we are doing all the vendor due diligence on the, 25 different IT vendors or 25 different vendors that we have that have access to private information. So, I think that's a big question. I know there's a couple solutions out there that people are using, but, that's going to be part of that documentation. Individual employee security and user access rights. This is going to be a big one, and this one's going to be a hot topic. Essentially, you need to show that Joe over in trading doesn't have access to accounting systems, and Chris over in accounting doesn't have access to trading systems. If you have someone who is setting appointments for you, they shouldn't have access to client portfolio data. So we need to show where we're mapping out individual employee access rights. A lot of people try to complicate this, and it really doesn't have to be. Especially if you're a smaller firm, take an Excel sheet and column A, put the names of all your employees, in a row, write out the different systems that you have. It might be Office 365, just list the different systems that you have, personally identifiable information, and then list everyone's access rights in there. Are they an Office 365 admin? If they're an Office 365 admin and they are a trading assistant, maybe they shouldn't have admin access to Office 365, right? These are the things that we have to map out. So I know there's a lot of really expensive solutions out there. And if you're a large firm, maybe those make sense. I think if you're a firm under 50 people, you can easily get away with just attaching an Excel spreadsheet to that, where it shows where you've taken your employees and you thought about the different access to systems that they have and what level of information they have access to. So don't overcomplicate it. That's a pretty simple one to tackle. Information protection protocols and procedures. This is getting in again to, how are we protecting data? You can't say, we take industry best practices and write it off at that. You're going to have detailed information about how you secure data. Okay, we have a client onboarding form that comes in through Zoho Forms, which is backed by 256 encryption. That form then rests on our server before, walk through the details of how personally identifiable information is being handled. Cybersecurity and threat vulnerability management. You're going to have details of that program. I'll talk a little bit more about that in detail, but essentially your work cycle is going to look like doing vulnerability scans, finding vulnerabilities, assigning those to individuals to solve, and then of course following up and making sure that they're solved. So how are you going to manage that process? How are you going to track it? We're going to need to have that written out in the policies and procedures manual. And of course, your response and recovery. If you experience a ransomware attack, if you experience a phishing attack, what is your response? What is your recovery? These are going to be kind of different items that are outlined in the policies and procedures manual. A couple different notes here, just as you're kind of thinking about your own documentation. This is another one too, the response and recovery. I think that's okay if you want to include that in your general business continuity plan. I see a lot of firms that do that, and I've never seen pushback on that. So I think that's totally okay to do if you want to include your cyber response and recovery in your kind of your firm's overall BCP plan. Kind of same thing I was saying about the policies and procedures manual, whether you want it separate or in just your firm's overall policies and procedures manual is totally your preference. So, the SEC now wants to know your story, and apparently so do your clients. On the Form ADV Part 2A, we're going to be required to give a narrative description of your cybersecurity program. Again, this is going to be one that is probably best to engage either a combination of individuals, a cyber expert and a legal attorney, or maybe a legal attorney with some cyber expertise. But I think you should be very careful in how you craft this language. You're trying to balance several things. One, making sure you properly disclose. Two, making sure you're not scaring your clients with, disclosing that you've had a phishing attack, which, let's make up numbers, but let's say that's happened at 80% of firms. We want to make sure clients are properly disclosed, but we also don't want to scare them away. So, if you need help, definitely seek it in writing that narrative description in your Part 2A. One of the things I mentioned, and it's been a little while since I've been on the CCO side of things and dealt with the Form ADV and filing. But one of the things mentioned in the new 20649 language is that the narrative description needs to have inline XBRL, which is a machine readable language. I honestly know very little about how to do that. It's on my to-do list of research, but it's worth mentioning out there. I'm not exactly sure, how you take your narrative description and turn it into a machine readable language. I'm sure there's attorneys out there familiar with filing this information that would have more insight into that, but that is of mention. And then, of course, with the narrative description, you must report your perceived threats and any past events. I mean, again, looking at a security consultant and perceived threats, that's a really hard one to find. And perhaps the final language will have more clarity on what a perceived threat is. But I mean, a firm can have any number of perceived threats, and how do we perceive that? So, these are some of the questions that come to my mind when I read through this, but ultimately, these are the items we'll have to cover now in the part 2A when this does come to rendering. So we also have mandatory incident reporting now, and this is a crazy one. It must be filed within 24 hours of incident. If you've ever been on a cyber response or seen what's going on, it's extremely difficult to get a very clear picture of what happened within 24 hours. So, with this new language, again, as it says, the final language may differ, but we have a 24-hour response period. During the comment period of 20649, if you read through the comments, a lot of them do make mention of, like, how do you, 24 hours is not enough time. You really can't put together a coherent response in that amount of time. So the SEC's response to those comments were essentially, well, you need to file this form as soon as possible and then amend it as needed and frequently as the investigation unfolds. So you have an employee click a phishing link, within 24 hours, that has to be reported. You're going to have an extremely hard time finding a cybersecurity expert that's going to be able to respond and report within 24 hours. So, however that needs to be filed, but that'll go on the form ADVC. Again, I'd highly recommend, having legal assistance in filing that. As the language states, we must report all instances that affect operations and confidentiality of data. An employee clicking a phishing link, I can tell you from an ethical hacker procedural standpoint, there are a number of steps, often difficult and not guaranteed, that take place between an individual clicking a phishing link and that hacker getting access to personally identifiable information, especially if the employee takes the proper protocols after realizing they clicked on the phishing link. So there's a lot of steps in there, so how do we, again, it just gets back to how do we properly identify that within 24 hours, and how do we properly disclose, that the phishing didn't affect personally identifiable information. The other side of that too, even getting a third party help to help audit or verify that there wasn't a loss of confidentiality information is going to be extremely expensive. These kind of investigations are not cheap. They're time consuming. There's a lot of data to go through. So, I think that's going to be cost prohibitive for a lot of firms, and one of the things I'm concerned about. So, again, that's the way it looks like, Form ADVC is going to sit and what's going to need to be filed on it. Vulnerability and risk management. It's like almost vulnerability and risk management. Would that be? It's something of that nature. If you've seen my other webinars, I love using Maltego, a program for this. I need to get a referral credit with them or something. It's an amazing piece of software that I wish I had when I was in the operations role at an SEC registered firm. But I use Maltego to go in and build these data repositories for my clients regarding cybersecurity, because again, it just helps us answer a lot of information. So in the graph you see above, I'm not going to have a live demo of Maltego. Again, there's other webinars, you can see that. But if you zoom in on these individual dots, they're going to be different information, different systems that are connected to our network, different individuals, what access to systems they have. This is what we're mapping out here. So I use Multigo to do my network mapping, so I know everything that's on my network, what's connected, what operating systems are it's running, serial numbers, MAC addresses, everything I include in that network map. I use it for an IT checklist. So if I need to remind myself to log into the router every 2 months and click that update button, I can use it as an IT checklist, use it for patch management. So my vulnerability scans will feed into Multigo, and it'll let me know if I have an employee or someone that's running an outdated version of Windows, or we have an outdated server on the network. This will help me work through that. And when I do have an issue, I can use Multigo to bring in other users and assign it to them, so that we have a chain of command and can show where we are addressing these vulnerabilities. I also use it for user access rights. So, I said earlier, it doesn't have to be complicated. You can use it on Excel. If you want to make it complicated, Multigo does an awesome job of that. It really helps track user access rights, HR admin. I use it for reputation management as well, track versions of our website, social media interactions. So Multigo does a lot of the heavy lifting for me, and we use it pretty extensively with our clients. The license is a little bit expensive. I think it's around $1,000 a year for the license for the full program. Most people don't need the full program. They can get away with the free version if you're a smaller firm. So don't let the cost scare you if you want to check it out. But it's super powerful in handling all of this different information. Especially the hard part is setting it up. That's kind of the time-consuming pain part. But once you have it set up, it's an awesome, essentially cybersecurity dashboard where you can keep tabs on everything that you need compliance wise. And then there's also the record keeping aspect. So we're going to have a 5-year look back on this. The things mentioned in the 20649 are going to be all cyber policies and procedures manual versions. So make sure you keep ongoing versions of that, whether you want to keep cloud versions in Office 365 or actually keep time-stamped physical copies. I think that's up to you. Your annual review documentation, you're going to need to keep that again with the board of directors sign off for going back 5 years. All documentation related to your audits and your pen tests. So diving in a little bit as you think about that and you start looking at providers, there's a very big difference between a vulnerability audit or a vulnerability scan and a penetration test. The SEC is notorious for interchanging these two terms, and they're two very different tests with two very different purposes. The way we have that discussion with our clients is if you do not have custody of assets other than for kind of incidental billing, if you don't have custody of assets, you probably don't need a penetration test. Penetration tests are very time consuming and very expensive. A starting price for a penetration test is going to be in the $40,000 range, and they're just not for everyone. So make sure you understand your firm's operations and make sure you understand the difference between a vulnerability audit and a penetration test. If you don't have custody of assets, and we're not worried about losing data, if all our assets are at Schwab, we really just want to be doing vulnerability scans to make sure we're protecting data, right? Because at the end of the day, those are the two things we're protecting, assets and data. So make sure you know the difference. The majority of firms without custody are going to need vulnerability audits. You're going to have to keep for 5 years your past regulatory filings and cyber incidences. So all of your reports that led up to the incident investigation, make sure you keep evidence of that, and also all your cyber incident reports that you're filing internally. Your written risk and threat assessments, however you want to do those, update those annually at a minimum, but make sure you're doing them. Those are ones that I know the SEC is going to focus in on. We see it more and more in a lot of SEC language, so I know that's going to be a hot topic for them. Your cyber insurance policies. This is one of those I really hate. Cyber insurance is it's a tough one. I don't ever put a lot of faith in them actually protecting or paying up if there is an event. So I tell people I wear two hats on this, because I would never want to be in an SEC or a regulatory audit and try to explain to an examiner why I don't have a cybersecurity insurance policy. But at the same time, when I'm thinking about my firm and thinking about the security and structure, this cyber policy is not going to be a leg I'm standing on to have my back, or to make sure that we get made whole in the event of attack. So regardless, that's something they want to see evidence of for the past 5 years. And then, of course, the board approval on all cybersecurity docs. So I hope that's kind of a clear overview, a very broad overview. I think the final regulation will change slightly. How it changes from the original writing, I'm not quite sure. I think the original writing is going to be spot on. And it's going to mean some operational changes for a lot of firms. I know a lot of firms have kind of scooted by through the years without doing vulnerability audits, or they've kind of written it off and said, oh, our data's in the cloud and we don't need to do that. Well, we still have to be performing vulnerability audits on the cloud. It's not a bypass, and I think a lot of people have taken that. And so this regulation is going to change the operational requirements, for a lot of firms, and what they need to be doing to meet, kind of goal A, protect the network, and goal B, make sure you have the compliance documentation for in the event of an audit whenever it comes around. So, if you need help with that, please definitely reach out. I'm certainly happy to help assist with that as a consultant for you guys. So, if that's something you're interested in, definitely reach out and set an appointment. And let me jump over to the questions here, and I'll jump through a few of them and make sure we're addressing them here. So the first one I have is the employee technology usage agreement just an acceptable usage agreement? Yeah, Michael, sounds basically the same thing. And we can talk details in there. I generally just like to see things, and also reach out if you like. I'm anyone that's interested. I'm happy to send you the template that I use for my clients, and you're welcome to adopt it for your own firm. But essentially, it's just outlining things like, make sure you're updating your computer, right? If you're running a Windows machine that was issued to you by the firm, make sure it's your responsibility to update that system. If you're traveling, make sure you're using a VPN when you're sitting at Starbucks, right? Just talking about general ways to use firm technology that's issued to them. I think one of the gray areas on that, and again, it's probably should be my tagline, but there's webinars where we cover mobile device usage policies and mobile device management. This is a tricky one. People do really weird stuff with their cell phones. And so, that's one thing that I like to see typed out in an employee technology usage agreement. If you're going to allow employees to bring their personal cell phones into the work environment and they can access work email or work files or whatever, we need to make sure they're definitely signing off on how they're using that device. Even though it's their personal device, they need to sign off on that. So whatever you want to call it, those are some of the things that I like to see included in that agreement. So let's see. Laura asks, she says, I have a question regarding vendor risk threat assessment. Which are the specific solutions some of your clients are using? So that's a great one. I think a lot of people are still trying to figure it out. The only solution I know that is geared towards SEC registered firms is one, and it's been probably over a year since I've looked at the system, and it may have changed names because I know they I believe picked it up under an acquisition of another company. But Smart RIA had a program called data governance, I believe. And in that, it was almost like a checklist. You could go in and say, okay, we're using Riskalyze, we're using Portfolio Center, we're using Elite Trader, or whatever systems you use, you could check mark them off, I believe, and it would go through and automatically pull those vendor due diligence documents for them. So that's one solution, if you want to automate it and have that stuff pulled for you. Laura, if you would follow up with me on email, I'll send you a template that I've actually used when I was in that role, Laura, anyone that would like this. But it was essentially a vendor agreement where they would, check mark off and say, hey, we'll send you the documents we've had from where we've done an audit. We request that, that sort of thing. So I'm happy to send you that template. And that's one way to walk through the vendor due diligence if you have a smaller, maybe a smaller vendor that you're dealing with. On the other side of that, if you're using something like Office 365 or AWS, Amazon, most of these documents are going to be readily available for you to download. Oftentimes you could just do a Google search Office 365 compliance documentation, and it'll take you to an Office Microsoft Office website where you can download those reports readily and put them in your folder. So, I think it's a little bit of legwork, and I think each vendor is a little bit different, but there are ways to walk through it with that. Bill asks, is penetration test required for firms that have custody of assets? Bill, that is a $1 million question. And I hope 20649 is going to bring more clarity to that. My conversations with clients is yes, if you have custody of assets other than for billing, and again, check with an attorney on this, but we've also had cases where the client would, or excuse my client, an SEC registered firm would have kind of coincidental custody via a trust that was given to them by a client. I think those are some of gray areas. And in my mind, I don't, in my non-lawyer mind, I generally don't consider them custody. But if you're doing something like Bitcoin mining, Bitcoin trading, or CPO type thing, and you do have custody of assets, yes, I think a penetration test is required. When I'm framing the conversation and when I'm framing the thought process in my mind, and we're thinking what a firm protects, it's essentially data and assets. And if all my assets are at Schwab, and Schwab, I'm throwing a name randomly out there, and I assume it's true, but let's assume Schwab is incredibly good at protecting assets of not being sent to unauthorized third parties. Well, that removes a lot of our risk. When assets go missing, when assets are fraudulently sent to a third party, investigations happen, FBI gets involved, right? Like, that's a big deal. When data goes missing, like, no one blinks an eye, honestly. Like, you report it all you want, no one really cares. So if all we're protecting is data, I generally recommend my clients, if all we're protecting is data, in other words, my clients don't have custody of assets, I generally say we stick with a vulnerability scan. If you do have custody of assets, if John Smith is a trader and he is trading assets that he has physical custody of, and if I could fish John and take over his computer and in some way enact a fraudulent third-party cashiering transaction, then the answer is going to be yes, you definitely need a penetration test. So right now it's a bit of a gray area, because I think I mentioned earlier, the SEC interchanges the terms vulnerability scan and penetration test quite frequently. So in my world, it's two very different things, and that's the conversation we have with our clients on how to frame, do you need a vulnerability scan or a penetration test? Catherine asked, does the proposed rule distinguish requirements between larger firms and smaller firms? Wow, right. That would be the ideal world. Unfortunately, no. And that is going to be a barrier for entry for a lot of smaller firms, because if you don't have, if you're a 1 or 2 person, 3 person shop and you don't have the cybersecurity expertise on hand, you have a couple options. One, try to find a managed service provider that can give those services for you and produce those documentation. You can hire a firm like us to come in and produce it for you. But it's been an ongoing issue in my mind, right? Like we get these regulations from the SEC, and they apply the same to Goldman Sachs as they do to Jane Smith working from her home, doing nothing but financial planning for college tuition, whatever the case may be. It applies the same, and that's been some of the issues. So for us, kind of breaking that down, and of course it's always a cost issue. Again, larger firm versus smaller firm. Some things you can address in procedures as well, and say, hey, we didn't do a vulnerability scan because, or excuse me, we didn't do a full penetration test because we don't have custody of assets. Therefore, we chose just to do a vulnerability scan on our cloud network to make sure that the cloud network's configured properly, to make sure Salesforce or AWS configured properly. So there are ways you can step through it and save money, but for the most part, the same rules are going to apply to larger and smaller firms. And I think it will be a barrier to entry. I think it's going to be an extreme cost for a lot of firms and an extreme change to the operational requirements. Especially if you don't have an IT background or IT expertise. It's going to take a lot of time to I think to produce this documentation. So perhaps the final posting will distinguish between larger and smaller firms. I don't see it going that way. In fact, we kind of see some of the opposite in a lot of ways. The I can never always jumble it up. NASAA, which leads a lot of the state regulatory bodies, was kind of first to lead on a lot of this and lead some of the firms into it. So even at the smaller state leveled firms, we still see a lot of the requirements. Another question is, we'll be filing our annual ADV update soon. Will the SEC expect our Part 2 brochure to include that narrative description of our cybersecurity risk? Will you help us write that narrative? Absolutely, I'll help you. I can try. Hopefully, depending on what the final regulation looks like and what exactly is required in there, it might be one that we resort over to a lawyer, which we can certainly help with in that case. But getting back to the core of the question, no, I don't think that is going to be required at this point. If there's any lawyers in the room, please feel free to chime into the comments here and correct me if I'm wrong. But I believe we generally get 180 days from the time of posting to the time we actually have to show compliance. Please correct me if I'm wrong on that, and don't quote me on it just yet. So there will be some time, and most people are going to be filing their ADV by March 31st. So even if we get the final ruling before then, you'll still have a little bit of leeway in there. So in my mind, again, I always say in my non-lawyer mind, lawyers always seem to have their own way of doing things, but I don't believe that new Part 2 is going to have that in there. So maybe we'll get a pass on that for a bit there, Carly. But that's all the questions I have in there. Again, please feel free to reach out if anything comes to mind. I think I will probably pass around at some point at Part 2 of this, where we dive into some more of the technicals. If people want to see how Maltego works or how that's used at the firm level, I'm certainly happy to do that. And as I've mentioned before, I look around through the attendees here and I recognize a lot of names. We get a lot of great attendees, a lot of CCOs with a lot of experience, and a lot of IT people with a lot of experience here. So if you're ever interested in getting together and having a town hall, and we can all jump on a Zoom, of course, being a consultant, I'm always curious to see how other people are tackling this workload, the new regulations, what your thoughts are, what you're seeing that we might not be seeing. So if you're interested in that, let me know. I might set that up where we can all jump on. Just do a town hall and kind of talk about what we're seeing, kind of at the firm level, what we're working with and what's challenging. So keep a lookout for that if you're interested in that. But again, thank you guys so much for joining me and having these discussions. It's a true honor to have you here. I'll wrap up this recording and pass it around. Any questions, or if you'd like to schedule a meeting, it's really easy to do from our website. You'll also find links to all the past webinars that I mentioned several times and demonstration videos and that sort of thing if you're more of a do-it-yourself type of firm. So again, thank you so much, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.